Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu, dear viewers. So, in this episode, we will discuss the laws of compatibility in marriage, which is known as Kafa'at. Before we begin, please be sure to like, subscribe, and share this video for Sadaqah Jariyah, and follow us on other social media platforms, and visit our website, JK and Fatah website, for weekly Fatwa updates in the link below. Bismillah. So in this video, we'll be discussing 4 or 5 discussions in regards to compatibility. Number 1 is we'll discuss the significance of compatibility. Number 2 is the definition of compatibility. What is compatibility? How is it understood? Number 3 are the conditions around compatibility as outlined in the Sharia and the fiqh literatures. And finally is the most commonly asked question, that whether marriage without compatibility is valid or not. There have been differences of opinions amongst the Hanafi tradition. What is the standard accepted position? All of this will be discussed in this video. So let us begin. So the first one is significance of compatibility. Just to understand compatibility, what we mean is compatibility between the man and the woman in marriage. It is an essential quality every male and female seek before marriage. So to build a strong relationship in their future spouse is because when you propose to somebody, when you propose for somebody for marriage, for them to be there, for them to be your lifelong partner, then there's a lot of many of the things that we many of the things that we do search for is compatibility, to ensure that there is compatibility between the man and the woman, so that this relationship, this marital relationship, becomes long lasting. It becomes long lived. So much of it, however, depends on cultural settings, but the Sharia itself has outlined general principles and guidelines about compatibility. Now, there are many ahadith in which the Prophet ﷺ discussed compatibility. I'll just mention 2 hadith in which the Prophet ﷺ said. Sayyidah Aisha radiallahu anha reports, and this is a hadith recorded in Sunan Ibn Majah, and it's an authentic hadith. Sayyidah Aisha radiallahu reports that the Prophet ﷺ said, تَخَيَّرُوا لِنُطْفِكُمْ وَأَنْكِحُوا الْأَكْفَى وَأَنْكِحُوا إِلَيْهِمْ. The Prophet ﷺ said that select carefully. This carefully, just my interpretation here. So carefully select for your seed. So when it comes to marriage, when it comes to searching for a potential spouse, the Prophet ﷺ said, select carefully for your seed. And وَأَنْكِحُوا الْأَكْفَى, marry those who are compatible. وَأَنْكِحُوا إِلَيْهِمْ, and marry to them. In other words, marry your daughters to them. So in other words, the Prophet ﷺ saying that if you find a compatible person to your daughter or to your female family member, that who you are going to marry them, then ensure that you find a compatible person. Once you find a compatible person, then have the nikah done immediately and straight away. So that's one hadith in Sunan Ibn Majah. There's another hadith recorded in Sunan Ibn Majah, an authentic hadith, where it states by Muhammad, reports from Umar, who's the son of Ali ibn Abi Talib radiallahu anhu. So Ali ibn Abi Talib radiallahu anhu's son, Umar, he narrates from his father. He states that my father said, Ali ibn Abi Talib radiallahu anhu, that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said to him, Ya Ali, he said, O Ali, thalathun la tu'akhirha. There are 3 such things that you should never delay. So the Prophet ﷺ is advising Sayyidina Ali radiallahu anhu, there are 3 such matters which I will explain to you that you do not delay as soon as they become available. Number 1, as-salatu idha atat. Once salat time appears, once salat time comes, then do not delay it. Number 2, wal janazatu idha hadarat. When the funeral appears, when the funeral of a deceased person appears, you have to read the janazah salah. Do not delay it. Perform the janazah salah straight away. And number 3, wal ayyimu idha wajadta laha kuf'an. And number 3 is when you find a compatible virgin. If you find a compatible virgin, then do not delay in the nikah. So this is the basic significance of compatibility in marriage. So that's the first part we've dealt with. Number 2 is, what is compatibility? What does compatibility mean? The Arabic term used for compatibility is just a loose translation of the word, but it doesn't encompass the entire meaning. But the Arabic term used is kufu or kafa'a. Kufu or kafa'a. which literally means musawat. The fuqahas and the legal jurists state that it means musawat. Musawat, in other words, that equality, which means that as the man must be equal to a woman in marriage. So when a man, when he proposes to a woman, then he needs to ensure that he is compatible, he's equal, he's befitting for her status. He's not lower than her status. If he's higher than her in status, then it's fine. But he cannot be lower than her. If he's lower than her in status, then on apparatus, then he's not considered compatible to her. So it is the female side, therefore, it is considered. Its compatibility on the female side is considered, as the man cannot be lower in status than her, because compatibility is the right of the girl's guardians. The girl's guardians, i.e. the parents. Why is it considered to be their sacred right? Is because due to the sanctity of the nikah. Because Islam has sanctified nikah, Islam considers nikah to be a sanctuary act or a sanctuary tradition. Therefore, there has to be some compatibility. And this compatibility, just to understand from in the initial point, compatibility is the right of the legal guardians or the parents of the girl. So if, for example, the boy is not compatible, he's not a suitable compatible person to the girl, then they can object. But now, which leads to the question is that when is compatibility considered? When is compatibility considered? It's considered at the time of the contract of the nikah. At the time of the contract of the nikah, not afterwards, because after marriage, circumstances can change. So if circumstances change after the initial nikah contract, then even if there is now incompatibility thereafter, then that is not considered in the Sharia. So for example, that initially the girl and the boy, they were Islamically compatible. But yet many years after marriage, 2, 3 years, 4 years, or 5 years after marriage, for instance, now there was incompatibility. The man, for example, now he's now degraded in status compared to his wife. Then that incompatibility is not considered, because when we discuss compatibility, we are actually referring to compatibility at the time of the nikah contract in of itself. So we've discussed the significance of compatibility. We've discussed what is compatibility, when is compatibility considered. The fourth matter is now the conditions of compatibility. In what aspects, in what features, or what characteristics are compatibility considered? As I mentioned in the beginning, that compatibility generally revolves around cultural setting, but the Sharia has outlined general guidelines. Without going into too much of the details, there are 5 characteristics, there are 5 aspects in which the Sharia considers compatibility in between the man and the woman. Bearing in mind is that it is the compatibility of the woman's side is considered, not the man's side. So the man has to be compatible with the wife. So the scholars mention that there are 5 aspects, there are 5 areas where compatibility is considered. Number 1 is lineage. The lineage, in other words, their ancestral lineage. So there has to be compatibility between the man and the woman in their ancestral lineage. Without going into too much of the details, just for simplicity, is Arab is compatible to an Arab. So a non-Arab is not compatible with non-Arab. So for example, a non-Arab male is not compatible with an Arab female. There's no compatibility. So the compatibility is Arab for Arab. Number 2, Quraysh and Quraysh. So within the Arabs, there are certain conditions of compatibility, i.e. Quraysh and Quraysh. So for example, even if you have an Arab male, but he's a non-Qurayshi, on the other hand, you have a female who's a Qurayshi, then there's no compatibility in them. They have to be from the Quraysh between them. Many scholars have included Sayyid, so Sayyid and a Sayyid, they have to be compatible with each other. And finally, non-Arabs with non-Arabs. So all South Asians are compatible with each other. So for example, if you have a Pakistani male with a Bangladeshi sister, or you have a Gujarati brother with a Pakistani sister, all non-Arabs are compatible with each other. So there's no incompatibility between them. So you have Arab with an Arab, you have a Quraysh with a Quraysh, and non-Arabs vis-a-vis non-Arabs. So this is the case of lineage. So it's called nasab. Number 2 is religion, the deen. What this means is that a Muslim male and a Muslim female. So a Muslim born from a Muslim father and grandfather is compatible to a Muslim woman whose ancestors are Muslims. So just to explain this, when we talk about religion, we're not only talking about religion, the same religion between the male and the female, but rather it includes the religion of their fathers and grandfathers too. So just to understand, or their forefathers. So just to understand that the minimum criteria for a Muslim male to be compatible with a Muslim female is that he has to be a Muslim, his father and his grandfather has to be Muslim. That's sufficient. If a Muslim male, his father is a Muslim, his grandfather is a Muslim, but beyond that they are not Muslims, then he is compatible to a woman whose ancestors are Muslims, her father, grandfather, great-grandfather, great-great-grandfather, all the way above. So just up to grandfather being a Muslim is sufficient for him to be compatible with a woman whose whole ancestral lineage, all ancestors were Muslims. So if, for instance, if he was only a Muslim, but his father and grandfather are not Muslims, but she is a Muslim, her father and her grandfather are Muslim, then there's no compatibility. So one common example to understand this is a revert. So let's say a Muslim revert brother, who just accepted Islam, and let's say, for example, a Pakistani sister whose generation, about 5, 6, 7 generations above were Muslims, for instance. Now, because he is the only one that's a Muslim, but his father and grandfather are not Muslims, then he is not compatible. He's not compatible with to this Pakistani sister. However, if they're both reverts, for example, then they're compatible to each other. If, for example, only their fathers were compatible to each other, were Muslims, then they are compatible to each other. So this is just a simple example in relation to religion. Number 2. Now, number 3 is religiosity and piety. So the second we talked about deen and religion in of itself. The third one is now piety, which means that both should be at least practicing to the minimum level, fulfilling their obligations and fulfilling their fara'id. Now there are various different spectrums in this. There are so many spectrums in this regard, but I'll just give you a simple example because the books of fiqh are replete with detailed information which is not possible to all enumerate here. But just for simplicity, that if you have a practicing Muslim sister, she's practicing, she adheres to her religious faith, she prays the 5 daily salah and etc. So she is a practicing sister in general. Then she is not compatible to a Muslim man who is not practicing at all, who neglects his obligations. He doesn't pray his salah, for example, or for instance that he's taking drugs, for instance, or he's drinking alcohol, he's an alcoholic, for instance, okay? So he is not practicing whatsoever. He completely neglects his obligations and he is engrossed and engulfed himself in sins. He is not compatible to a sister who is practicing and who is religious. Yes? So compatibility must be religiousness. So long as they fulfill the basic obligations, then that is sufficient. That's piety. That was number 3. Number 4 is wealth. Now, when it comes to wealth, the fuqaha, the scholars explain, is that the man is compatible to a rich woman if he has enough income to provide for her expenses, to provide her with an accommodation, and to pay off her mahar. To pay off her mahar, to provide her with the basic accommodation according to her, to fulfill her needs, and to give her financial expenditures. If he sufficiently provides that for her, then that is sufficient as compatibility. Even though, for instance, let's say that she has, for instance, £100,000 in her bank account. She's a very rich woman. She comes from a wealthy family. Now, he is not from a wealthy family, but he has a stable job. And he's able to provide for her. He's able to pay her the mahar. He's able to provide her with financial maintenance. Then that is sufficient. They don't have to be equal in terms of their earning. Many people now, they do ask about what's your net worth, for example, or what's your annual income, for instance. So the disparity in their annual income does not make them incompatible, but rather they're still compatible so long as he's able to fulfill his financial obligation, pay the bills and etc. and so on. So that's the fourth aspect in terms of wealth. And number 5, occupation. Now, occupation, this is based on culture. This is based on what is culturally accepted and not culturally accepted. Even though the books of fiqh have discussed many examples, but the fact of the matter is that they're all based on culture. So culturally speaking, that if one profession is not considered to be compatible with another profession, and they're considered to be low in status compared to the others, then that will not be considered compatible. I'll just give one scenario, one hypothetical scenario. And again, let me just add this caveat, this could change over time. Let's say, for instance, you have a woman who's a doctor. She's a qualified GP, she's a qualified doctor, or she's a consultant, for instance. So she's very highly educated, she has a high job. and now you have a person who's uneducated, a brother who's uneducated, and he's a taxi driver. Now, clearly, culturally speaking, we don't consider them to be compatible. We don't consider them compatible. A taxi driver, vis-a-vis a sister who is highly educated and she's got a really high profession. Now, when I mention education, it's important that I add this point. I'm not discussing educational qualification in of itself, but I'm discussing profession. So she works in a very professional, in a high professional job. So there's no compatibility between them. So these are the 5 areas that in which compatibility in the Sharia, the compatibilities are considered. One is lineage, then is religion, then is piety and religiosity. Number 4 is wealth, and number 5 is occupation. And now finally, the last and final point is about whether the nikah is valid without compatibility. So if, let's say, in these scenarios that I have presented, in the examples I've given, that if the man, if he's not equal in status to the woman, to the girl, in any of those respects, and despite that, they have the nikah performed, is the nikah valid or not? So let's take an example. Let's say there's a doctor, for instance, a female Muslim doctor. She decides to marry a taxi driver, for instance. Now there is incompatibility, for instance. Or let's say, for instance, a Pakistani sister, right, that who's 5-6 generations above are Muslims, and she marries a revert brother who's the only family member, who's the only Muslim in his family, in his entire family. Parents and others, they are non-Muslims. So if they have the nikah done, which is they are incompatible, then is the nikah valid or not? Now, there have been a lot of difference of opinions amongst the scholars within the Hanafi tradition. However, the verdict and the fatwa that we follow is that the nikah itself is valid. But however, if the legal guardians, if her parents, if they disagree with this marriage, they have the right to dissolution. They have the right to dissolve this marriage. They have the right to either demand this man to separate, to divorce their daughter, or they can file their case to a Sharia council for this nikah to be dissolved, to be broken. But the ulama, the scholars mention, the condition for their objection has to be at the time of the contract of nikah or closer to the time of the contract of the nikah. If they do not object, or they do not raise the case to the Sharia council, for instance, now she's become pregnant, she's now expecting, the nikah was done, now after the nikah, she's now expecting and she gives birth to this child. After giving birth to the child and when she's conceiving, then now her legal guardians or her parents, they have no right to demand this marriage to be dissolved, because the haqq of fas, because the right to dissolution is only given at the time of the contract of nikah. After that, then their right is now absolved. They have no legal right Islamically to demand a separation, but now they are considered to be husband and wife. And one of the wisdoms in this is because, and one of the wisdoms of the ulama, the scholars mention, is because if they dissolve the marriage after the child is born or she's conceiving, then this will impact the tarbiyat of the child. So this is the final position that we adopt, that the nikah itself is valid, but the legal guardians, they have the right for this marriage to be dissolved up until if she conceives a child with this through this marriage and she gives birth to the child. Now, added to this, there are multiple scenarios that I want to present here, because we're living in a time where we have sometimes people, a girl and a boy, having their own secret nikah done. For example, they have like a secret nikah done, undercover nikah, what we can refer to as, without people's knowledge. Now, sometimes the issue of compatibility can come in. Now, even though in the Hanafi madhab, a wali is not required, a wali is not a requirement, is not an integral requirement for the nikah to be valid, but many people unfortunately have abused this. So there are a few scenarios. So there are 4 scenarios here that if a girl and a boy, if they were to get married. So you'll have to follow me. Number 1 is that a girl, she marries a boy with parents' consent to a compatible brother. So the girl and the boy, they both get married, they are compatible to each other with the consent of the parents. This, without a doubt, is valid. There's nothing wrong with this, and we try to encourage this. Number 1. Number 2 is, second scenario, a girl marries a boy with parents' consent to a non-compatible brother. So the girl, she marries someone who's not compatible. Let's say, for example, she marries a revert, but the parents have consented. They've agreed to this marriage. Then the nikah, without a doubt, is valid. And once it's valid, the parents cannot retract, nor can they demand a marriage to be dissolved on the basis of incompatibility. Okay, they cannot do it because they already consented before. So once they've consented, they cannot retract from that. So that's the second scenario. The third scenario is a girl marries a boy without parents' consent to a compatible brother. So in other words, that the girl and boy, they have the nikah done without their parents' consent, but they are compatible to each other. They are compatible to each other. Again, this nikah is valid irrespective if the parents agree or disagree, and they cannot demand for this marriage to be dissolved because compatibility is fulfilled. Because remember in Islam that the final decision to marry someone, to accept someone, rests with the girl, and the right of compatibility, it belongs to the parents. Now, if she has the right to make the decision for in her to choose her future spouse and they are both compatible to each other, then the parents' rights are fulfilled, the guardian's rights are fulfilled, and her rights are fulfilled, which is why this nikah is valid. And they cannot demand a marriage to be dissolved. And finally, the fourth scenario is that a girl marries a non-compatible brother without the parents' consent. So this last and fourth scenario is what I was referring to earlier on. That if a girl and a boy, if they marry together secretly, for instance, secretly, although we discourage this, we highly discourage this, but we're looking at it from the legal perspective, that if the girl marries a non-compatible brother, but without the parents' consent, there are differences of opinions in this matter. Some Hanafi scholars are very strict and very firm that this nikah is not valid at all. And the second position is, which is the position that we follow, is that the nikah itself is valid, but however, the parents have the right for this marriage to be dissolved up until she conceives a child. Before that, they can demand, and they'll have to either ask the husband to divorce their daughter, or they have to petition the case to the Sharia Council. This is the preferred position, and this was the position of Sheikh Mufti Abdul Waheed and many other scholars of the Deoband school. And there are many evidences that they present that where incompatibility, it still validates the nikah. For instance, Hazrat Bilal Habshi radiallahu anhu, Bilal radiallahu anhu, he was from Habasha, he was from Abyssinia, that he married an Arab lady. So clearly, in terms of the lineage, they were incompatible. But yet, none of the Sahabas objected to this. So this is the evidence from the Hanafi point of view that the nikah, even in spite of incompatibility, the nikah is still valid. And for example, Zainab bint Jahash radiallahu anha, her marriage with Zayd bin Harith radiallahu anhu, they're both incompatible because she was from the Hashimi, she was from the Quraysh. Zayd bin Haritha was a non-Qurayshi. Yes, so non-Qurayshi, a Qurayshi was vis-a-vis non-Qurayshi, because Zainab bint Jahash, she was from the Hashimi family. But yet the nikah was performed and the nikah was considered to be valid. So in short, in the Hanafi madhab, the nikah without compatibility, it is itself valid. But however, if the walis or if the legal guardians, if they object, they have the right to dissolve this marriage or put in the condition of conception. So I hope this provided enough clarity on the issue. I look forward to seeing you again in the next video. Jazakumullahu khair. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.